Hello viewers, and welcome to another episode of Elections by Numbers. Today we're talking about the Free State, Maryland. Maryland is one of the oldest states in the nation, and it was named after Queen Henrietta Maria, the wife of King Charles I of England. Maryland is also famous for Maryland crabs, and for a good reason. The state puts out more blue crabs than any other state in the country. Maryland's biggest city, Baltimore, is also closely associated with Gothic horror icon Edgar Allan Poe. Poe spent his time in Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, I believe Richmond, Virginia too, but he is very commonly associated with the city of Baltimore, as that's where he ultimately met his mysterious demise. And if you're a football fan, I found this interesting. The Baltimore Ravens actually took their name from The Raven, the short story by Edgar Allan Poe. I had no idea. In all honesty, this video is probably going to be a pretty quick one because Maryland is not having Senate elections or governor elections this year. The only elections of national interest are the 8 congressional House districts that are up for re-election this year, as well as the presidential election, of course. So let's move right along and get into the House elections for the state of Maryland. I just mentioned there are 8 congressional House districts in the state, and therefore 10 Electoral College votes. And the current balance of power in the U.S. House for the state of Maryland is 7 Democrats to 1 Republican. The most competitive district, according to the Cook Political Reports Partisan Voting Index, is Maryland's 6th district, as it has a partisan lean of +6 into the Democratic column, which is the closest to the center of any of the 8 districts. And actually, it's the only district with a single-digit value lean. Maryland's 6 was recently represented by a man named John Delaney, who's actually probably more famous today for his presidential bid this year. Delaney was one of the first, actually I think the first candidate to announce his run that occurred in July 2017, so 3 years ago. He only waited about 6 months into Trump's first term before declaring that he was running. Does the district in Maryland with a lean of +6 into the Democratic column have a chance of flipping Republican this year? Well, let's take a look at raw House turnout numbers in the form of a double line graph and figure that out. So looking at this, you'll notice right away that Democrats hold a pretty consistent edge in turnout over the past decade for, this is the total amount of votes for all House candidates running in the state every 2 years. And in fact, there is also a pretty noticeable separation between Democrats and Republicans going into 2018. Actually, at first glance, it even looks like a slightly wider margin than there was in 2016 between the two parties, which means that Democrats were excited to turn out in pretty high numbers in the state during this last midterm election cycle. Other than that, though, there's nothing extraordinary that we can determine from this line graph, other than the fact that I think Democrats are still breaking away from Republicans in raw numbers. So let's toss that aside. Coupled with that fact and the fact that Maryland's 6th district is slightly left-leaning in a state that is already represented by a Democrat, and considering the fact that current Representative David Trone won his election in 2018 by about a 21-point margin, I can say with a fair amount of certainty that this district is not going to flip, and therefore I don't think any of Maryland's districts are going to flip. So ultimately, we still have a balance of 7 Democrats to 1 Republican in the U.S. House for Maryland. Let's make that official and put it on our first map. Mark it. And now it's time to talk about the presidential election of 2020, starring President Donald Trump and Democratic challenger Joe Biden. Looking at Maryland's voting history, we can learn that it was a state that last voted for a Republican presidential candidate in 1988 when they broke for George H.W. Bush over challenger Michael Dukakis by about just under a 3% margin. More recently, though, we saw Maryland break for Hillary Clinton over Donald Trump in 2016 by about a 26-point margin. So over the last few decades, we see a state that is drifting heavily to the left in terms of presidential elections. And obviously, Trump is going to have a pretty tough uphill battle in Maryland this year, but maybe he gets an edge from voter turnout ratios. In other words, how Marylanders vote for presidents versus how they vote for House candidates. Let's pull up those numbers to see if he has any kind of advantage there at all. Okay, and looking at these numbers, these percent values, there is clearly not any advantage at all for Donald Trump over Joe Biden in terms of voter turnout ratios. From 2012 to 2016, the Democrats' value virtually remained unchanged, whereas Republicans lost, about 15 percentage points. So Marylanders were more enthusiastic to vote for Mitt Romney than they were for Donald Trump, just as a whole. And considering Donald Trump's approval rating in the state of Maryland, I don't see any reason why he would have a value greater than 98.02% this year. So no advantage in the voter turnout ratios for Trump. Let's toss those numbers aside. Lastly, we have to consider his approval rating in the state to determine who's going to win the state's 10 electoral college votes this year. As of this video, Trump's approval rating in the state is at minus 42 points, which is in fact one of the worst approval ratings in any state in the country for Trump right now. So bearing in mind everything we've seen so far, greater turnout in House numbers, raw House turnout numbers, no advantage in the turnout ratios, a terrible approval rating for an incumbent president. I think we know how this is going to turn out, but let's turn to Pollbot to take all those variables and turn them into an equation to determine how this is going to happen. Pollbot. And there we have our result. Pollbot telling me that Biden is going to win the state of Maryland over President Trump by about 22% margin of the vote. While this is a lower margin of victory than Clinton got in 2016, it is still a pretty significant margin of victory at being over 20%. I see no reason why this state would be competitive at all at this point. So let's make that official, make this result official, and put it on our presidential map. 10 more electoral college votes for Biden. Mark it. So all the results are in for the free state and there are no real shocks. Let's talk briefly about the future of Maryland by bringing up an old line graph and a new one and talking about this more. First, looking again at the raw turnout numbers for House candidates in the state over the past decade, I want to bring your attention to the slope values that are associated with both of these lines. So for the Democrats' dotted line, we see a slope value there of 78.7. That's that value preceding X. What that means is, on average, every 2 years, Democratic House candidates running in the state of Maryland have received a total of 78,700 more votes than they received during the previous election cycle. In other words, Democrats are gaining more votes every 2 years on average over the past decade. Republicans are also gaining numbers. Their value is 23.2. So when we compare the value of 23.2 to 78.7 for the Democrats, we still see Republicans gaining numbers, but at a rate of less than a third of that Democrats are gaining. So at the House level, we still see a state that is breaking in the direction of Democrats, but of course, remember from our first section that Maryland's districts are heavily partisan in their respective columns. So this won't ultimately mean much in terms of changing House seats necessarily, unless the maps are redrawn sometime soon. But it is a good window into how the average Maryland voter is drifting politically over the past decade. Next, I want you to look at this new line graph I've cooked up for you. These are slope values that are displaying the average rate of increase or decrease in those presidential to House voter ratios that I was using in my calculation earlier. We see a Democratic slope value that's pretty close to zero, meaning that they voted for Obama in 2012 and Clinton in 2016 at virtually the same rate. But the Republicans' negative slope value here means that they were more enthusiastic to vote for Romney over Trump. Probably due in large part to the fact that Mitt Romney was a pretty popular Republican governor in the state of Massachusetts at one point. Massachusetts is, of course, as we've already learned, a pretty blue state. And Maryland finds themselves, honestly, in a pretty similar situation. They have a Republican governor, Larry Hogan, who is popular in a state that, as we can probably determine by now, is pretty heavily Democrat. So let's toss those graphs aside and I'll give you my consensus on Maryland. It's unlikely to change to any significant degree in the near future politically. Where Maryland does get interesting though is, as I just mentioned, Larry Hogan, their Republican governor currently serving, people are looking to as possibly the future of the Republican Party in a post-Trump world. He of course has cross-party appeal. He was able to win over enough Democrats to become the governor in the first place. So any voters that Trump has pulled further to the right may feel kind of alienated by a governor, by a Republican like Larry Hogan, who has cross-party appeal. But if Maryland is going to drift back to the right, hit an inflection point and drift back to the right anytime soon, it will be because of leadership from their governor, Larry Hogan, who enough voters have taken a liking to over the years. If Hogan eventually does end up running for a presidential ticket in the near future, I will take a much closer look at Maryland to see if they could possibly break for him. But anything short of a candidacy from Larry Hogan will not be enough to pull Maryland across that line. And that just about does it for our latest episode of Elections by Numbers. I want to thank you, the viewer, for tuning in today. If you like what you saw, please hit the subscribe button to get updates on new content as it becomes available. I upload videos every Monday and Thursday. I'm also on Twitter, and I update that account with which state I'm covering next ahead of the scheduled release date. So if you want to stay ahead of the curve, please give me a follow on Twitter, and that link is in the description. Thanks again for watching, and thank you for voting. See you next time.